Well, my name is Rama, and I'm the Food Safety Program Head for Perry Johnson, Registrar of Food Safety. We are located in Troy, Michigan, and we certify companies to the various GFSI standards in the food chain, namely manufacturing, production, storage and distribution, packaging, and retail, etc., etc. Well, the objectives of this webinar are twofold. To provide an overview of the requirements of the 4 GFSI standards for storage and distribution, and also to outline the requirements of the FSMA sanitary transportation rules. The agenda, I have just divided the agenda into 2 sections. Section A is about the GFSI standards for storage and distribution, and Section B is about the FSMA sanitary transportation rules. Let me take you through the details of the GFSI storage and distribution standards. The question is, why GFSI certification for storage and distribution? As some of you know, the Global Food Safety Initiative is a result of collaboration between some of the world's leading food safety experts from retailers, manufacturers, food service companies, as well as service providers who are all active in the food supply chain. One major benefit of the industry of third-party certification under GFSI is the avoidance of duplication driven by the GFSI goal of one certified, accepted everywhere. And certification to GFSI benchmark standards provides substantial economic benefits through the avoidance of duplication of audits. Companies that obtain third-party certification have greater opportunities within the buying community, thus providing greater market access for their products. GFSI certification of facilities involved in the storage and distribution activities related to food is a third-party confirmation that the facilities have good storage and distribution practices in place to ensure safety of food that are stored and are transported. Well, we have 4 GFSI benchmark standards that can be used to certify storage and distribution facilities. And these are, number 1, SKF Core Edition 8, even Edition 7.2, that is a current edition, is also possible, but Edition 8 is going to be implemented from January 2, 2018. Now, the other standard is BRC Global Standard for Storage and Distribution, Issue 3. We have one more standard to certify storage and distribution facilities, that is IFS Logistics, version 2.1. And finally, very recently, the 17/21 accreditation standard, which is FSSA 22000, that can also be used for certifying companies for storage and transport, which is version 4.1, version 4.0. Currently, version 4.0 is the most recent one. Now, it is extremely difficult for me to compare the elements, all the elements of these 4 GFSI standards in an hour. So I've got just an hour to cover everything. So it's not possible for me to go through each and every element. But I've chosen only 4 areas of standards for comparison, namely scope. What about inclusions? What about exclusions? What are the differences between the 4 standards? And are there any differences in audit duration? Are there any differences in the requirements of the 4 standards? What about audit protocols? So these are the 4 areas of comparison, actually. Let me just focus on the first one, which is the scope of certification. First, I'm going to focus on the SGIF code. The SGIF code for storage and distribution is applicable only to storage and distribution of food products. Okay. The scope of certification includes the site, and it is also product specific. And in SGIF, the entire site, including all premises, support buildings, silos, tanks, loading and unloading bays, etc., they all must be included in the scope of certification. And when we talk about the products, again, SGIF certification is product specific. The food sector category or categories, or products, a group of products stored and handled on site and or distributed by the site, shall be identified and agreed in the scope of certification. So what this means is, before you get certified, so you will have to have a contract with the CB, certification body, and these things must be identified and agreed in the scope of certification. And if you seek any exemption, there are some exclusions that I have documented underneath. Exclusions under SGIF are non-food products. You cannot certify, rather, you cannot make use of SGIF code for certifying non-food products. Okay, and now let's move on to the BRC standard for storage and distribution, issue 3. This applies to companies providing storage and distribution of products. And this standard can be applied or may be applied at any point in the distribution chain from primary production to retail, subject to some restrictions on the scope of products handled. And those exclusions are given underneath, such as live animals, loose, bulk, and unprocessed agricultural products, fuel sold in bulk, motor vehicles, etc., etc. So essentially, the standard can be applied to non-food products as well. And the standard covers distribution at any point in the distribution network for products. For example, this could include distribution from farm to processors, primary processor to manufacturer, manufacturer to off-site warehousing, warehousing to retail depots, retail depots to store, store to final consumer, even internet shopping. Okay, so all these are covered. And when you talk about food products, the following food products are included: packaged food products, bulk storage and transportation, all by road only, of food products, such as flour, oil, sugar syrup, wine, etc., etc. And this standard can also be used for certifying transportation of loose food products, even storage and transportation of loose food products, and that are limited to open boxes and trays of fruits and vegetables, etc., etc. So the requirement here is, in all such cases, a product shall be received into storage and released into distribution without any further processing, without any further preparation. So basically what it says is, you just receive them and in those conditions specified, and store them and release the products to the market without any further processing, sorting, or processing. Okay. And I said this is also applicable to non-food products. It covers packaging materials. Could be primary packaging material, it could be secondary packaging material. The standard can also be used for certifying companies that store and distribute consumer products. And yeah, things like that. Individual items, shrink-wrapped items, packaged in bulk, or even building materials. All these things can be included under the scope of certification. So what about the next standard, that is IFS? IFS Logistics is a standard for auditing companies whose activities are logistics oriented, again, for food as well as non-food products, such as transport, storage, loading, unloading, etc., etc. It applies to all types of transport delivery by road, by rail, by ship or plane, frozen or refrigerated products, or even ambient stable products. So IFS standard covers, the scope covers all these products. What about FSSC 22000? An integral element in the food chain is a storage system and the transport network. So it is a very important component of the food chain, food supply chain. And supply chain entities such as growers, food processors, they all rely on proper transport and storage practices to ensure that their products arrive safely at the final destination and also in good condition. Okay. FSSA standard, I said in the beginning that FSSA very recently extended their scope to include storage and transport. This standard sets out the specific food safety management system requirements for organizations in the food chain. One such requirement is to establish, implement, and maintain prerequisite program to assist in the controlling of the standard. So FSSA standard has got prerequisite programs for various sectors such as manufacturing, packaging material, animal food manufacturing. They have established a separate PRP, prerequisite program, for storage and distribution as well. Okay, and the specific food sector category under FSSA 22000 is G, and that is again divided into two types. One for distribution of perishable foods and the other one for non-perishable foods. And obviously there are some exclusions, and in the case of BRC, storage facilities under the direct control of production site management. So that means, I think, if you have a storage facility within the manufacturing site, that cannot be used for certifying for BRC storage and distribution, or any operations that involve open food products. Again, you cannot use BRC standard to certify those products. IFS logistics is not applicable to processing of food or non-food products, except, for example, freezing and thawing process, or it cannot be included for importation, rather importing food from other countries, trading of goods, etc., etc., and transportation of live animals, cannot be used. The standard cannot be used under those conditions, actually. Okay. Similarly, SQF is not used for non-food products. Let's move on to the other aspect, that is audit duration. In the case of SQF, there are two stages, as you all know, that SQF is a two-stage audit. Stage one is document review. Stage two is implementation audit. So it varies from a half day to 1 day for document review under SQF, and 1 to 2 days for stage two. The reason, there's an asterisk mark here. It says less than 10 employees, you can have half day for document review and 1 day for stage two. And again, the duration depends on a number of factors, such as scope of the audit, the size of the site, design of the storage areas, and number of people, etc., etc. Also, it depends on the complexity of the SQF system design and documentation, the level of mechanization, whether it's labor intensive or not, all these things determine the audit duration under BRC, sorry, under SQF. What about BRC? It's a single stage audit, as you all know, and it's typically a day and a half. And another half day for report writing. So basically, it's a 2-day thing, day and a half for the audit, half day for report writing. IFS again is a single stage audit, and it says minimum 1 day. FSSA again, like SQF, is a 2-stage audit. Again, the duration is calculated using a table, table B1 in ISO 22003, 2013. And, I'm not in a position to give you the exact number because it depends on the number of HACCP plans you have, number of employees, and whether you are certified or certificated to any other management system standards. All these factors are taken into consideration to calculate the audit duration. Now let's go through the next 5 or 6 slides. I'm going to compare the requirements of the various standards. Again, these are the 4 standards: SQF, BRC, IFS, and FSSA 22000. First, I'm going to focus on senior management responsibilities. Are there any differences between these 4 standards? Absolutely, there is none. They all require you to have a corporate policy. The terminologies are different, but essentially all these standards require you to have all these things: policy, corporate structure, which is nothing but your organization structure. Are you customer focused? Do you determine the needs and expectations of customers? How do you do that? Again, all these standards have the same requirement. Do you conduct management review? Again, each and every standard requires you to conduct management reviews, with certain inputs and certain outputs. Okay. Again, it's not the intent of the presentation or the webinar to go through each and every detail of the requirements. Now, what about quality and product safety management system? So this is the second requirement. And under that, you have document control, record keeping. What about, having a comprehensive safety and quality system? Again, all the 4 standards require you to document and implement these requirements. Then the third requirement is resource requirement, essentially in terms of human resources, financial resources, and other things. This includes providing certain infrastructural facilities as well, such as sanitary and staff facilities, toilets and lunchroom facilities and all that, providing proper training, establishing hygiene rules, etc., etc. Again, they have similar requirements. And the fourth one is realization of service. Under that, you have several requirements such as contract review, suppliers and service providers, specific requirements for material handling, how exactly you handle the material stored in your facility. Do you have good traceability system? And what about the preventive maintenance and repairs, and cleaning and disinfection? Do you have SSOPs? Do you have any cleaning schedule and things like that? Again, absolutely no difference between these 4 standards. Okay. Again, that continues. What kind of equipment do you have for storage and distribution? Do you have a comprehensive pest monitoring system? How do you receive your goods and store? How do you dispose your waste? And Do you have any service providers? Okay, all these things have, are addressed in the 4 standards. Again, it continues actually. Transport, any specific transport requirements, such as should they be frozen, should they be chilled, and things like that. Again, the details are in each and every standard. Okay. Then the 5th one is realization of service. Okay. Do you have a good internal auditing system? What about site inspection? Do you have any GMP site inspection kind of thing? If you have any monitoring device, such as thermometers and things like that, continuous monitoring, do you calibrate them? Do you have any complaint management system? When you receive complaints, how do you deal with those complaints? How do you handle your non-conforming product, a product that is rejected, damaged, and things like that? So do you have any procedure for product recall? Have you implemented the procedure? Things like that. Again, absolutely no different. And that's the beauty of harmonization, and that's the beauty of GFSI, because the main purpose of GFSI is to harmonize the different standards. This clearly shows that these 4 standards are totally harmonized in terms of the requirements. Absolutely no difference in those requirements. And the last one is about, in the requirements, product defense, okay, which is again food security, food defense, or product defense, and things like that. Do you conduct any assessment, vulnerability assessment, for instance? You have proper site security measures. How do you control visitors and things like that? Absolutely, I think there is no difference. There may be slight differences in the requirements, but all the 4 standards have similar requirements. Now let's move on to the second section, section B, which is about FSMA rules, sanitary transportation rules. So there are 4 main themes of FSMA. I'm not sure how many of you are fully aware of the transportation rules and FSMA rules, but there are 4 main themes of FSMA, namely prevention, inspections, compliance and response, import safety, and enhanced partnership. So enhanced partnership between domestic and foreign government agencies through the creation of domestic integrated food safety system. And here we talk about help to ensure that imported food meets U.S. food safety standards. FSMA came into effect just to protect the food supply chain within the country. So the question here is, how can you make sure that the imported foods meet U.S. food safety standards? And also conduct food facility inspections at a predetermined frequency and using new tools and all that to ensure compliance with the new FSMA regulations. And also create a regulatory system that prevents the occurrence of food safety standards. So I think these are the 4 main themes of FSMA. Okay. Okay, it continues actually, and Congress in fact directed FDA to create regulations to fully implement the 4 themes of FSMA, the one that we saw in the previous slide. Because FSMA is so multifaceted, many rules are required for its implementation. And in fact, there are 7 rules of FSMA, and the ones in red, number 1, number 2, and number 5, they are in fact quite relevant to the storage and distribution activities. The PC rules are applicable to the facilities that, by this time you're well aware of the fact that the PC rules are applicable to the facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for human consumption within the United States, And facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for export for human consumption in the United States. Okay, this is also applicable to the facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for export for human consumption in the United States. So that means if a facility in another country is manufacturing food that is going to be exported to the United States, that facility is also covered under, if they manufacture human food, then priority controls for human food. If they manufacture animal food, then the PC rules for animal food are applicable. And if they produce vegetables and fruits, the produce safety rule is applicable. And there is no option. Not complying with the applicable rule is considered a prohibited act. So let me just spend a minute or a couple of minutes on the PC rules for animal food. This rule is applicable to all facilities that are required to register with the FDA under Section 415 of the FTC Act, that is Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, because they manufacture, process, or pack, or hold animal food for consumption in the United States. Of course, there are some exemptions, and the rule is also modified under certain conditions, actually. Okay, and these requirements are covered under 21 CFR Part 507. Both domestic animal food manufacturing facilities and foreign facilities importing food into U.S. must comply with the rule. Okay. I wanted to show you this slide because this is, I wanted to show you the difference between HACCP, that is the Codex HACCP model, and the other one, which is the preventive control model. In a HACCP system, hazard analysis identifies process-related hazards. The Codex model is essentially a process identifying process-related hazards. And in the absence of these controls, once you have identified the hazards, then you're going to come up with the appropriate control mechanisms. So if you don't control, then they are going to pose food safety risks. So when these hazards are identified, then you come up with critical control points. And these are essential to control the process to prevent hazards from carrying forward. So then once you have identified the control points, then you're going to come up with critical limits. So once you have critical limits, then you do monitor the critical limits, whether they are in compliance or out of compliance and things like that. When they go out of compliance or when they deviate from the assigned critical limits, then you apply corrective action. So what about the other model, that is the preventive controls either for human food or animal food? Again, the basic requirement here is you identify the hazards under chemical, physical, and biological hazards. And after that, you come up with preventive controls. Instead of critical limits, the new regulation, that is the preventive controls for human food, says not every hazard can be appropriately controlled using process control parameters such as CCPs and all that, and that's why they are making use of the description preventive control. Basically, there are 4 types of preventive controls: process preventive control, allergen preventive control, sanitation preventive control, supply chain preventive control. And for all these controls, you have to assign parameters and values. As usual, you monitor the parameters and values, and when you have deviations, then you apply either correction or corrective action, because FDA thinks that in some cases correction is more important than corrective action. Example, sanitation failure. In a sanitation failure incident, you're not going to do the root cause analysis or corrective action. Immediately you will go for recleaning. So recleaning is nothing but correction. So FDA feels that correction is also equally important in addressing the deviation. Then you have verification and record keeping, etc., etc. So that's the these are some main differences between the regular codex model of HACCP and the preventive control model, actually. Now, so this is these are the components or constituents of a preventive control food safety system. Do the hazard analysis, you have process control. Process control as a preventive control, you have supply chain, allergen control, sanitation, you have recall plan, which is also a kind of preventive control. GMPs are outside the rectangle because GMPs are equally important in the sense they are required to mitigate some of the hazards or a few hazards you have identified. GMPs are also known as prerequisite programs. Okay. Now, the general CGMP requirements for holding and distribution of ingredients, human food, byproducts, and animal food. Basically, there are, I think there are some basic requirements. Containers and bulk vehicles are appropriate to protect against contamination from animal food. I just wanted to show you some slides here. So the containers, such as these ones, are appropriate to protect against contamination of animal food, for instance, from microbial as well as physical contaminants. They must be constructed of appropriate materials and cleaned as necessary, and also should be maintained properly. The other requirement is facilities may use different container cleaning methods and frequency of cleaning. Okay, so but at the end of the day, the requirement is they should not lead to cross contamination. Again, another set of pictures. Containers and bulk vehicles must be examined prior to use. So here you have a tanker. So let's say this is some kind of milk tanker. The tanker must be examined before you actually start filling milk into it. This is an interesting slide that shows the hazard analysis process. Okay, there are many definitions of hazards. Okay, this slide graphically depicts the hazard analysis process. The process starts with the most general category of hazards. That means those that have the potential to cause illness or injury to humans or animals. So what is the definition of hazard. Hazard is the one that leads to either illness or injury. Okay. Then after that, the hazard category narrows to those hazards that are known or reasonably foreseeable. These are general hazards. Then they narrow down to what is known as known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, which are hazards that are specific to the type of food or to the facility. And finally, we have what is known as the hazards requiring a preventive control. In both the preventive controls for human food and animal food, you look for general hazards, then you narrow down to known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, and finally then you come up with what is known as hazards requiring preventive control. Here you apply those 4 preventive controls, namely process, sanitation, allergen, and supply chain preventive controls. So here the question is, who are all covered under the sanitary transportation rules? The sanitary transportation rule is one of the 7 foundation rules proposed in January 2013 to create a modern risk-based framework for food safety. So the goal of the rule is to prevent practices during transportation that may create food safety risks, such as failure to properly refrigerate food, inadequate cleaning of vehicles, failure to prevent or rather protect food. So these are, I think the goal is to prevent these practices. The rule builds on safeguards envisioned in 2005 Sanitary Food Transportation Act. In fact, there was an act existing before the Sanitary Transportation Act or rule, the FSMA rule. Before that, in 2005, since 2005, we had what is known as the Sanitary Food Transportation Act, or SFTA. And because of illness or outbreaks resulting from human and animal food contaminated during transportation and incidents, and there were lots of reports. So that is why these things actually triggered the evolution of the FSMA rule, namely the sanitary transportation rules. And this rule actually establishes the requirements for shippers, receivers, loaders, and carriers. And these entities actually transport food in the United States by motor or rail vehicle. Whether the food is offered for interstate commerce or not, but still everybody is covered. All these entities are covered by the sanitary transportation rules. It is also applicable to persons, that is shippers in other countries, who ship food to the United States directly by motor or rail vehicle, say from Canada or Mexico. Okay, it's equally applicable to those carriers. Now the question is this applicable to everyone? Who is not covered under the sanitary transportation rules? So these entities are not covered, or these activities are not covered. Food that is transshipped through the United States to another country, okay, or food that is imported for future export in accordance with this particular section, which is 801D of the FTC Act, that is neither consumed nor distributed in the United States. If it's not going to be consumed, if it's not going to be distributed within the United States, then this rule is not applicable, okay? Or food when it is located in food facilities that are regulated exclusively through the entire facility, that is under USDA, such as meat inspection, rather meat processing facilities or meat transportation, poultry products inspection, rather transportation of storage and transportation of poultry products and also egg products. Because these are covered by USDA regulations, these things are not covered under sanitary transportation rules. These are some exempts, actually. These are exempted from the rule. Shippers, receivers, or carriers engaged in food transportation operations. That those people are those companies that make less than 500,000 in average annual revenue, or transportation activities performed by a farm, or transshipped through the United States to another country, say from Canada to Mexico via United States. Transportation of food that is imported into the country but for future export. So all these activities or entities are exempted from the rule. I'm just going to give you some definitions here, but if you're not quite keen about it, we can skip. But I think you should definitely know what we're talking about. What is a bulk vehicle? What is a carrier? Who is a carrier? Who is a loader? Who is a receiver? For instance, a loader is a person that loads food onto a motor or rail vehicle during transportation operations. Very specific definition. Similarly, carrier. A carrier is a person who physically moves food by rail or motor vehicle in commerce within the United States. Similarly, the other slide also has given some definitions. Shipper, transportation equipment, transportation operations, etc., etc. Let's see some key requirements of the sanitary transportation rules. Okay, so we are going to focus on vehicles and transportation equipment, transportation operations, training, records. What are the requirements of the new regulation with regard to these things? Let's have a look. Vehicles and transportation equipment. So the first requirement is the design and maintenance of vehicles and transportation equipment. They must ensure that they do not cause the food that they transport to become unsafe. Essentially, it's common sense, but the design of these things should be done in such a way that they do not make the food unsafe. For example, suitable and adequately cleanable. The design should be suitable and adequate to clean so that they can be maintained properly. Design of vehicles and transportation equipment used in transportation should be in such a way to prevent the food from becoming adulterated within the meaning of again, there is a reference to Section 402 of the FTZ Act, which is basically, should not cross-contaminate, should not become adulterated. Vehicles and equipment must be maintained in sanitary conditions for their intended use to prevent the food from becoming unsafe during transportation. Okay, and it continues actually. Vehicles and transportation equipment used for temperature control for safety reasons, product safety reasons, must be designed, maintained, and equipped to provide adequate temperature control to prevent food from becoming unsafe during transportation. Similarly, vehicles and transportation equipment must be stored in a manner that prevents it from harboring pests or becoming contaminated in any other manner that could result in food becoming unsafe during transportation operations. Okay, so what about the key requirements for transport operations? This requirement applies to all shippers, carriers, loaders, receivers, or all engaged in transportation operations. Okay, and here the entity that is subject to this part may in fact reassign in a written statement its responsibility. You can transfer the responsibilities to other entities, of course, with rather through a written agreement. So that is the provision under this subpart. Okay, section 1.908 of the CFR Part 1. That's the provision. Okay, and what are the requirements under transportation operations? Again, this is given. Responsibility for transportation operations are carried out in manner in compliance with all requirements of this subpart, must be assigned to competent supervisory personnel. Okay, and again, the requirement, one of the key requirements of transport operations is all transportation operations must be conducted under such conditions and controls necessary to prevent the food from becoming unsafe, such as taking effective measures such as segregation, isolation, or to segregate food from non-food during storage, during transport, etc. Taking effective measures such as segregation, isolation, and things like that, so that there is no cross contact. The first one is about segregating raw food and non-food from food. Similarly here, to prevent them from cross contact, say for example, allergen cross contact. Okay. And again, this one is about temperature control, etc. And it goes on and on. Necessary conditions and controls for the transportation of relevant type of food, such as animal food, animal feed, human food, etc., etc. Again, some responsibilities of shippers, receivers, loaders, etc. It says, they should have written procedures to ensure sanitary transportation of food. So that means these entities are required to have written procedures for sanitary transportation. Again, this slide provides some information about the requirements of shippers. Okay, vehicles and equipment are in appropriate sanitary condition. It is a responsibility of the shipper. If you want to know the definition of a shipper, you can refer to one of the previous slides. So that's where the definitions will be of some use to you. Again, they need to maintain some records and all that. We are going to see what type of records are to be maintained by shippers, by receivers, etc., etc. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. Again, this is also about the requirements of shippers: adequate temperature control, monitoring temperature control, again, maintaining some records, temperature records, etc., etc. This one is for shippers again, shipping and transporting of product in bulk. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Again, it's quite possible the shipper or carrier may transfer the responsibility to another entity. In that case, they must have it in writing under a written agreement. Okay, that's the third bullet. Requirement for loaders: food not completely enclosed by a container. Okay, so there are two types actually. Loaders to ensure if the food is not completely enclosed by a container, again, they have to make sure that loaders must ensure that the transportation equipment is in a sanitary condition, no adequate physical condition, no visible filth, no pest infestation, etc., etc. And if the food requires temperature control, the loaders must verify the specification provided. It is a responsibility of the loader to verify the specification provided by the shipper in accordance with they'll have to make sure that the temperature specified by the shipper is actually getting implemented. So that is a responsibility of the loader. And what about the receiver? Receiver also must take adequate, they must take steps to adequately assess that the food was not subjected to temperature abuse and things like that. So that is basically upon receipt, the receiver is going to verify the temperature. So that's the kind of interpretation that's coming out of this requirement. Okay. And what about carriers? So requirements for carriers. Okay. Again, this is for bulk vehicles and all that. So this is an important requirement which I want to spend a couple of minutes. I know I'm just going to, I mean, I've got another 8 to 10 minutes for completing my presentation. But let's talk about the key requirements with regard to training. Training of carrier personnel in sanitary transportation practices and documentation of the training. So basically, I think carrier personnel must be trained in sanitary transportation practices, and you should also document the training, meaning maintaining records. This training is required when the carrier and shipper agree that the carrier is responsible for sanitary conditions during transport. So this is required when there is an agreement that the carrier is responsible for sanitary conditions. When the carrier is responsible for sanitary conditions, carrier must provide adequate training to personnel engaged in transportation operations. They should also include potential food safety problems that may occur during transportation, basic transportation practices, etc., and the responsibilities of the carrier. And all these things must be provided, and the training must include all these things, and there should be adequate training records. Okay, and training must be provided upon hiring and as needed subsequently. So this is for carrier personnel, and as I told you, they must establish and maintain records. Records must include the date of training, the type of training, and the persons trained. And these records are subject to records requirement. Again, that's going to come up in the next slide. So what about records? So shippers must maintain these records. The records must demonstrate that they provide specifications such as operating temperatures to carriers, etc., etc. Okay. So again, written agreements in the for a period of at least 12 months beyond when the agreement and procedures are in use for transportation practices. Say, for instance, the shipper is transferring the responsibility to somebody else. So that, and I told you in the previous slide that some sort of written agreement is required. So those agreements are also called records, and they must be maintained as per this particular section, section 1.912 of the CFR Part 1, Subpart O. Okay, what about records requirement for carriers? So these are some requirements for carriers. Written procedures required for, again, they will have to, such as cleaning records, sanitation procedures, and things like that. They need to be maintained for a period of 12 months beyond. And training records, okay, again, for a period of 12 months, 12 months after creating those records. Okay. And we come to the last slide, which is those are specific records to be maintained by carriers and shippers. So this is about miscellaneous records. Shippers, receivers, loaders, and carriers which operate under the ownership or control of a single legal entity must maintain records of the written procedures. There are certain written procedures, as I told you, like for transportation, for maintaining the cleanliness of vehicles and equipment, etc., etc. They must be maintained for 12 months, for a period of at least 12 months. Again, the they are also shippers, receivers, and loaders and carriers must also make available those records that are required by this part. Again, these are going to be inspected by FDA if required. The request may come either oral through the request may come orally, or there could be some written request. In those cases, if you're one of those entities, such as shipper, loader, receiver, carrier, you must be in a position to provide those records to FDA inspectors. So now the question is, are you ready for the sanitary transportation rule? Okay. So if you know, I mean, if you want additional information, additional training, we'll be able to provide training on transportation rules, any of those 7 FSMA rules. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, you can now raise those questions. I'll be able to answer your questions. Thank you very much.